My name is Andrea Linsky. I am the Director of Emissions Neutral Buildings at Alberta EcoTrust. We have the same set of slides we use for these ENBIX supported sessions today, but I'm not going to go through the details again because we've done them a few times. What I'm going to talk a little bit more about in this session is about Alberta EcoTrust Buildings team and some new work that we're doing around deep energy retrofits. But before I get there, I do want to make sure that everyone knows that we've got a fantastic team of partners that we're working with and our funders as well. So here's where I'll talk a little bit about our retrofit accelerator. This is a teaser. We will be exploring deep energy retrofits here in this panel with some fantastic minds here in Alberta. We have a brand new program that we're about to open up at Alberta EcoTrust. We are one of the conditional recipients of the NRCan Deep Energy Retrofit Accelerator Initiative, or the DRE program, or DRI program, that many people have heard of across Canada. And we're in the process of ramping up a full program to help commercial, multifamily, residential, institutional, light industrial, building owners and navigate the deep energy retrofit process. And not just supporting the owners, but also helping to build a retrofit ecosystem. So if we are going to take on mass adoption of deep energy retrofits in this sector, we need to make sure that we've got these people duplicated, triplicated, quadruplicated all across Alberta doing work like this, as well as all of the actual construction teams and the rest of the design teams and the product manufacturing and all of these bits and pieces that need to come together. And so that's a lot of the pieces that we're trying to put together in this program that we're developing. In addition to that ecosystem, we're also supporting building owners from start to finish through a deep energy retrofit process. I've been working on energy retrofits for on the customer side for almost 15 years in my career, and it is tough to navigate when you've been doing it for 15 years, let alone someone who may have never done it before. So the intent is to have a place where people can come for free service. You're assigned a coach, and they help you through the retrofit process from start to finish. So that is what we're working on. I will put in a very, very shameless plug. We are currently hiring a program manager to run this program. So if anyone here has retrofit experience on larger buildings and is keen to do what I would consider a pivotal program in Alberta's history, please do come and take a look. So before we get too far here, just if you have interest in this program that we're talking about today, feel free to reach out to us at buildings@albertaecotrust.com. We are just ramping things up with a soft launch aimed for June and full launch in the fall, pending our funding fully being approved. But we've got Luke, who is the CEO from Panelists. We've got James, the managing partner of MCW Consultants, and Tanya, the principal of Carbon Lead for Western Canada for Stantec. So some folks that have been doing major deep energy retrofit work across Canada and here in Alberta. So we'll start with our questions, I think, if we're ready. All right, so the first question focuses on a little bit about you, obviously, and then I'd like to know more about what work you're doing here in Alberta, but also more widely across Canada. And how does the work that is happening here sort of tie into those big national goals and work that we're doing? And what kind of challenges and opportunities specifically in Alberta are you running into in that work? So maybe we'll just start with James.
Hi, everybody. My name is James Furlong, managing partner at MCW. We're a 60-year-old consulting engineering firm, mechanical, electrical, and focus, but we also have an energy performance guarantee company where we're also the ones swinging hammers and getting funding and guaranteed decarbonization for that. That's about a 30-year-old business for us. Here in Alberta, we're focused primarily on universities, municipalities, Indigenous, and also, strangely enough, out there retail, just based on where we have existing relationships for it. Nationally, we'd extend that to include a lot of work for the Fed in terms of the Department of National Defense. And some of the main challenges here versus our national portfolio tends to be a bottleneck of people, a lack of understanding of what the funding opportunities are, and people continually telling me that the technology that works in some areas will work just fine in Alberta. In some cases, the jury's out on that. So
Luke?
So yeah, hi, my name's Luke Ferdinands. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Catalysts. Catalysts is a tech platform and service provider that basically turns companies' energy and sustainability strategy into action. And we work with customers who have large, complex business operations, so generally really large portfolios of buildings. It might also have fleet, might also have other business processes that they need to factor into their decision making. And our main role, like kind of dumbed down, is really to help them figure out what to do first, what to do next, and what to do after that to meet their goals most efficiently. What was the second part of the question?
The work that you're doing specifically in Alberta.
Yeah, so specifically in Alberta, we've been involved with a lot of apartment owners. So I'll talk mostly from a rental apartment perspective today. We have been working with customers like Avenue Living to develop their deep emissions retrofit or reduction program. And we're working with a number of other apartment owners to sort through the portfolio, identify the best opportunities in Alberta and beyond, and help them execute on that. So really today, most of my perspective will be from the apartment side, not from the everything side.
Good afternoon. So my name is Tanya Doran. I am the Western Canada Carbon Lead with Stantec Consulting. So Stantec is a large engineering and architecture firm with a head office in Edmonton. So the team I lead really focuses on a number of different attributes, so whole life cycle of carbon in buildings. So that includes holistic sustainability, health and well-being, and then of course energy and carbon reduction on both new and existing buildings, followed up with another part of my team that looks at kind of that source energy decarbonization, that community scale, and then finally that commissioning, retro-commissioning, that end of that life cycle, so we can start it all over again. So really looking at that full life cycle of buildings and how we can look at buildings as a system and not just as one particular outcome overall. So in terms of what we're doing in Alberta, we probably cross over a little bit with MCW. Lots of consulting with both public and private, helping them set the stage and be ready for some of the goals that we have set. We really are seeing more portfolio owners starting to address what this means. I think there's some eyes opening in Alberta a little bit on what that is. There's not as much surprise or deer in the headlights that I'm used to seeing for the last couple of decades that are out there. They're starting to hear the message loud and clear that they need to start to prepare in that regard. So a lot of that work is, energy audits, energy retrofitting, helping people manage their data, get that data in place, and then on that other side, that question that James mentioned as well about funding. What does that funding look like? Where is the funding? And how do they prepare to access that funding in order to meet their own ESG goals?
So the last part of that question was around opportunities and challenges. And I don't know if everyone felt like they had an opportunity to speak about that enough, but I'll open it up, and if not, I have a little piece I'd like to add.
I can start with that. I think there's actually two places. I think for the first, maybe the first challenge is I often see we have a number of clients who have made a commitment, but they don't know where to start. They haven't managed, they don't even, sometimes utility bills are even hard to come by because they don't manage them, somebody else pays them, they're not looking at their utility usage. It's really, they're not even measuring it, so they can't manage it. So that's probably one of the first hurdles that I've seen overall. And then really helping clients that have made those commitments find that roadmap to what those commitments are. And there's a good example that I'll use. We just recently worked with a school board in Saskatchewan who has a size of 50 schools in their portfolio. They came to us, they said, what can we do? And so we really worked with them to develop a process within their budget, help them identify what that roadmap looked like, and help them acknowledge where they could find the right strategies within each one of the schools in their portfolio by age in a lot of cases, so that they could start to do the implementation measures based on the funding that their board had committed from now until their goal of net zero by 2045. So, we're starting to see the now what scenarios starting to come to fruition in terms of implementation and helping clients make, good decisions as they move forward. And I think the key to that is also being ready for funding. So that particular client now is ready for funding as it comes available. They have studies at the ready. They can identify and acknowledge what those GHG and or energy savings are going to be and what the implementation measures are, and most importantly, what the costs associated with implementing them are, so they can both budget and or access those funds. So those are I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity.
So just to build on what you said, we also come across a number of customers who have explicit goals and really no plan on how they're going to achieve them. Specifically with our apartment customers, our average apartment customer has 625 buildings spread across 6 or more provinces. So the first step is really helping them understand where in this landscape across their portfolio are the best opportunities. And so when we look specifically at Alberta, there are both advantages and disadvantages. And a lot of people point out that, well, there are no incentives here, so it's hard for us to get started, which is true. Like there aren't a lot of incentives compared to elsewhere, but there are also a lot of advantages. And so specifically on the apartment side, I mean, we've got great solar and wind potential in the province here. You can argue it's a positive or negative, but electricity rates are much higher than they are in many other jurisdictions. The emissions are higher, so if you have specific emissions goals, projects at buildings here can make a bigger impact than they can in Manitoba or elsewhere. And we also have a favorable regulatory regime with regards to rents, and so there are ways that the business can help pay for these things, on top of whatever financing and other kind of tools might bring to the table to really make this work.
Maybe just to build on that, coming at it from a different perspective, it's felt a little bit on my end uniquely to be kind of a matchmaker lately. We've been getting a lot of calls from financiers and finance companies with pots of hundreds of millions of dollars saying, we need to get this out, we need to get it out in the market like quickly, and this includes some of the big 5. And lowly old me getting those phone calls, I can only imagine they've gone through quite a list of people before they're getting quite desperate to find somebody who just wants to take their money for decarbonization. I've never had that in my career.
Who knew that was going to be a problem, right? So I think the number I heard last week is there's $1.5 billion they need to get into the market. And that's like throwing a chair off the Titanic on the problem we have a little bit. But it's $1.5 billion, right? We really have to get there.
And the strings seem to be getting looser, not tighter, and the regulations lighter, not tighter. And so when we have conversations with certain clients, they're going, this all sounds fantastic. When's the shoe going to drop? Like, there's got to be some other catch. And they're obviously, there's no such thing as a free lunch, but it's a lot more compelling than it's ever been in my career in terms of that. And that's almost... I think we've been so horsewhipped by strings attached and funding coming and going that we just can't wrap our heads around that. It's persistent, it's there, and it seems very real.
I think that's a bit of an Alberta phenomenon, that whiplash scenario that we have. But I think there's also, you talk to the ability or to the need to have to be prepared for these funding opportunities when they become available. And I tell a story about a client because I love the feds. Thank you for supporting these programs. But when you drop a program on December 22nd and you expect a full new building to be, the application to be there on March 31st, nobody's really ready for that. It better be on the shelf. So a client calls and says, we have this funding, there's $25 million. We want to apply for it. I'm like, great, do you have drawings? I have drawings. I got a watercolor, an artist rendering of what they could have imagined it might have looked like 5 years ago. That's what they thought was going to be funding ready to get them $25 million, where they had to demonstrate GHG reductions. I had to call and say, no.
Just wait 6 more months and they'll accept that.
Yeah, okay, good. I'll let my client know.
That's fantastic, thank you. And that's actually one of the things we found when we were looking to set up and putting forward the funding, a proposal for the retrofit program. We said really clearly there's no shortage of financing and money available to do this. It is how people access it and how complex it is to figure out how to navigate that ecosystem. I've spent 5 years working with the Canada Infrastructure Bank on projects, and I still don't fully understand how bits and pieces of these things work. And so part of what we're looking to offer is not only that project management support, but also understanding the financing pieces and making sure that can be shared. Great, and then, okay, so I think our next question we have is about of course I don't have my screen lock on, so just give me a second here, is around working with the owners of buildings, because that is a big piece of the discussion. So what are some of the most common questions or comments that you get from building owners when you're going into doing project work with them? And what goals do you set, or do they set in doing this type of work? And how do owners make decisions that support deep energy retrofits, given that there isn't that grant-specific piece in Alberta that sort of takes away that risk factor? Like, how are you seeing them make the decision to take this step? So maybe we'll start in the middle this time. Is that okay, Luke?
Absolutely.
Alrighty.
Yeah, so in terms of how customers are making this decision, I would say in my experience, really they're looking at the business case of that particular building. What are the outcomes that we're going to get if we undertake this project? And that's regardless of the incentives. The incentives might improve the business case. In some cases, it might not make a material difference. But at the end of the day, it's really just a decision about the finances for that site against their specific criteria and potentially whatever goals they may or may not have set as a business.
I just build on that by saying that often what seems to be the catalyst is deferred maintenance and systems being on their last leg, whatever that happens to be. And so a discussion starting around, well, if we have to do capital renewal with this, I have somebody who's asking me about decarbonization, how can we align those things? I am also starting, in my experience, to see a lot of, well, net zero maybe someday, but how do we get as far along down that path as any funding will allow us to, and be net zero ready seems to be kind of a big driving factor for it. And whether or not they're aware of the financing options out there, it does tend to be rising energy costs and operating costs and that gaping maw of deferred maintenance that's going to swallow them up if they don't deal with it sooner rather than later.
So I agree. I think that main driver right now is funding and how they're going to pay for this. We all have the same goals. I think that's starting to become clear. We all have to get to the same goalposts at some point. That's starting to become clear. Really what those measures look like, how they're going to be able to afford them. I think the one thing I do want to focus on a little bit is there is no free money. Like, we're hearing there's grants out there. You're going to work really hard for that money. And, you know, they are changing the rules a little bit. We can do different things at $27,000 a ton than we could at $4,000 a ton, if that's what that grant looks like. We're going to look at different measures. There's going to be different ways to get to those goals. There may be higher GHG returns on some of those. So there's clearly some different paths to how we're going to be able to do that, but you're going to work really hard for every dollar that is grant money. There is no free money. Your consulting team is going to work really hard. Your owners are going to work really hard. In some cases, there's required measurement and verification and pieces on the back end that you're going to work hard for a number of years to ensure that those dollars are well spent. And then where there's additional funding, low interest and other programs, that is the same. They have goals to meet. Their KPIs include GHG reductions. It is not about just giving money for retrofits. This is not about, if this was residential, this is not about granite over green. This is about truly seeing carbon reductions, you know, happen. And I think some of those cases or some of those things that are starting to shift is that discussion around when. When do we pull the trigger? You know, especially in Alberta, as that grid greens, when do we start to look at electrification? You know, right now I have clients who have put in all new systems and they just realized after their new boilers went in, they just locked in the price of carbon and they're going to maybe pay $300 a ton in 20 years and they're going to start replacing systems potentially before end of life. And if you were here this morning and you were paying attention to the embodied carbon conversation, those are equally important. There's no rebate on that. Once they're in, they're in. That carbon's gone. We've spent it. So how are we having that larger conversation now to inform some of those decisions? And a lot of that involves a crystal ball. You know, I have 3 different versions of what our grid's going to look like between now and 2035. I don't know which one to believe. So it depends.
Yeah, I was going to say almost coast to coast, it's increasingly becoming, well, we can do this, but we're not sure that the grid's going to be there to support you in that. And if you're the last one on the block, you might be left out. So there is a little bit of FOMO going on, as my teenage daughter would say.
Agreed.
I was going to add, I was talking with my colleagues the other day about, you know, what do they think the building owners are really going to be asking about that when they want to come to this program. And actually, my colleague Kate lives in a a condo in downtown Edmonton, and she says that they're paying $70,000 a year in carbon tax. Yeah, so that'll get you to the table pretty quickly to have a discussion with a free coach that might be able to get rid of that for you, or at least a chunk of it, right? Fantastic. Okay, so question 3 we have here for everyone is around tools that you are using or that we should be using to help us figure out how to do deep energy retrofitting on buildings. And, you know, feel free to talk about any sort of tools that we are working or we should consider, both technical tools, but also potentially the more social tools out there that we could consider. So we'll start with Tanya on this one, I guess.
Awesome. Well, for those of you that know me, I think usually I end this conversation with mandatory energy disclosure. No more voluntary. Like, this is the game changer, especially for building owners. So, you know, large building portfolio owners have been, you know, understood the business case for energy reductions, energy efficiency, the cost of carbon for decades. We no longer have to have this conversation. They've had building certification policies as a requirement. They've understood what energy does to their bottom line. For those of you that were looking forward and have portfolios across the border as well, and they've seen the SEC require carbon disclosure coming in the near future, even though it's softer than what was advocated for, that's a game changer for our portfolio owners still in Canada. They're probably not going to do something different on both sides of the border when they have to report it. So I'm a huge fan for bringing that policy tool in. It was mentioned in the Pan-Canadian framework. There was some, you know, scuttlebutt that it was going to come in 2026, starting to get building owners ready for that. That fell off really early on. Hearing maybe 2030, we certainly see it coming in, we have it already in voluntary programs, both in Calgary and Edmonton. So we're catching, the top 5 or 10% of leaders, those who were probably already prepared to disclose their energy usage because they are the leaders, not the laggards, are part of that program. So we're celebrating, you know, the top few percent of building owners here, and, you know, make it mandatory. Everybody likes to keep up with the Joneses. I think that would move this a lot faster and a lot further than it would, especially as we see ESG goals coming for every single tenant.
I would certainly echo what you said about building disclosure. I think mandatory disclosure is an excellent tool to spur some action. I think in the conversations that we're having with customers, there are a couple other things that are really driving the conversations. First is just that regulatory change. So in Vancouver, we've seen them move beyond mandatory disclosure to actual performance metrics in terms of emissions for existing buildings. That's got people's eyes wide open. And certainly they're questioning, like, where's that going to come next, which is a great question to be asking, and how do we get prepared for that? I think even, and admittedly, some of the customers we're working with have buildings that have really been neglected for a long while. You know, even just this change in the boiler efficiency requirements that are coming into place next year are really making them look at what do we even have out there, and where is this going to be a problem? And if we're going to make that investment, how far do we take that? And is this the opportunity to go a bit deeper? And actually, I would say in the types of organizations we're working with, the biggest push for corporate buy-in on these initiatives has been pressure from investors. And the big money that's behind these organizations saying, you have to do something, it's time to get serious, has initiated a different level of focus. So as individual investors and as people who are part of that community, I think the continued emphasis on investor disclosure and all the other tools that they have in their toolbox is really important.
Maybe just to take a little bit of a different tact, because I agree with all of that. We found that the labor crunch on good people to understand viable energy measures and get it through and get it built has resulted in us marrying our historic database of old audits and measurement and verification stuff with AI and energy modeling tools to try and speed up the time that it takes us to do thousands now of parametric runs of all different combinations of measures and get that done very, very quickly. Where that's now falling down is we can get our models done in hours instead of days. However, then it will go off for costing and it'll still go into a vacuum for 6, 8, 9 weeks. So we're trying to figure out how we not step on the toes of our valued trade partners vendors, RS Means, and others, but still be able to harness that data so that you can bring the financing, the capital aspects of it, right along with the ability to do the analytics really quickly. The other side of it is that use of tools and trying to find people who deeply understand controls and kind of intuit what buildings are doing with some of the analytics software that's out there, like the SkySparks and the Copper Trees of the world, where they're monitoring thousands and thousands and thousands of data points in a building. And when you know how to read those tea leaves, you can come up with some really interesting measures. But again, human beings are the limitation, and AI hasn't been trained quite well enough yet in our experience. So lots of promise there. The caveat is like anything, if anybody here has a modeling background, I'm a recovering one, garbage in, garbage out. And just because there's AI to it, that's like the old .com for those of you who were around at the time. It doesn't mean it's gold-plated, doesn't mean it's perfect. It sure sounds sexy, but like anything else, you have to gonna have a human being in there. So I'm not losing sleep that AI will take our job, but we are certainly seeing it magnify the effects of quantity surveyors, analysts, engineers. They can get 3 or 4 times more work done in a week, which is rather exciting, and they're gainfully employed. They're just busier.
Layer on top of that, though, the fact that every single one of these grant programs or funding programs or investment programs, not one of them moves without a cost attached to it. So that delay is real. So when you get a grant that drops and they need an application in 10 weeks, it's not a reality. So we also have to be realistic to those market pressures.
There's often not a great feedback mechanism to the differing grants and funding mechanisms that are out there. So they see it go, they can determine whether the money's leaving quickly enough or not, but not why. So that would be something that would be great to see that tied up. What I will also say for AI, where it has been really, really helpful, is feeding into it what the report needs to look like for, say, CMHC, and then your energy model spits it out exactly how it needs to be, and bureaucrats really like repeatability, and I don't blame them. Helps that, speed up on the approval side once it is in there quite a bit.
There's, I think, just one other tool in our toolbox, and we heard about it again this morning around code. And I think the one thing that, again, if you've known me before, you've heard me say this, but the one thing that I'm hoping you all leave with today is codes are for laggards, not leaders. Codes are the absolute minimum we all have to do to avoid breaking the law. Codes are for laggards, not leaders. They are not going to advance our industry to achieve our goals. They're going to drag up the leaders to bring up that minimum floor. So it is the very minimum that's required. Like, that is the key. And we're bringing up, and Justin from the City of Edmonton can probably talk about that. I know there's some great data there. You can reach out to him later. But we're really bringing up in Edmonton the last 20% when we adopt NECB 2020 next week. It does exactly what it's intended to do by pulling up the laggards. So every time I see something that requires code, and trust me, I have projects where code is being achieved by 0.1% because it's been value engineered and there's a perception that's there. 10 years from now, those tenants are not going to be happy with their developer. And do you want to be the developer at the door that says, well, that's okay. So think about that portfolio, what that looks like, and bring on the mandatory disclosure. Because I personally want to go to that developer and put up the label.
Excellent. So our last question from here, and we have a whole bunch coming in from the audience, so we'll do some of those as well, relates to moving on this. And so to set a bit of context, the National Resources Canada Deep Energy Retrofit Program is a program that they designed, my understanding, I don't speak on their behalf, but they've essentially designed it so that there are numerous different versions of this program being run across Canada. I think there's maybe 11 different versions, each unique in how it's been designed, and they're doing that to test out the different ways that we could roll out deep energy retrofit programming across Canada. So we've got the next 3 years here worth of all of these entities running these programs across Canada, and then all of the individual recipients have to figure out how to scale up to get enough information about what works to be able to allow a future program potentially to scale up. So how would you, what sort of advice do you have about how we could move faster on this work? We'll start with James.
I think they should do regular industry feedback, see what's working well, where the bottlenecks are, and try and diagnose and unclog those. I think that would be a great help. I think working with some of our utilities I think we all have, well, I'm going to back up. I think we have to be comfortable with uncertainty. Not everybody is going to be comfortable with uncertainty, so if we as an industry can come together, including utilities, and try to match the reality of what things like our grid are going to look like in the future with what some of the aspirations are, I think that will allow more organizations to take the leap with certainty that they won't be with a stranded asset that can't be turned on or not used the same way that it would be. I think the other thing that's not often talked about is right now the focus is on capital for investment and getting things built. We're finding this acutely in our Indigenous communities that we're working with. We will put things in with all sorts of bells and whistles, but there is no training and no support for ongoing operations and maintenance of that. When it costs $5,000 to fly somebody in remotely and spends 3 days to spend 15 minutes to change the fan belt on the fancy air handling unit, there's a challenge there, but there's also a huge opportunity. So I would actually like to see INAC have more of a role with CIB and some of these other groups and bring the economic and the social aspects into it a lot more.
I think from my perspective, one of the great challenges that customers are seeing in adopting deep energy retrofits is that risk that they have to take up front to see if this is really feasible. And I believe that's part of what the DRE program here is going to be addressing, which I think is super important. If we can help building owners walk through those first couple steps to see, is this really going to be practical? Is this achievable? Or are there barriers that we haven't foreseen that costs are going to be 5 times what we imagine? Like, let's just get that on the table right now without having to spend a ton of money. That will open the door to things moving much more quickly if we don't have to be so cautious with those initial steps.
Yeah, and I think I'll just give a plug for Surya here as well, is that the intention of Surya was to fill the gap. When we started this, I joke we started a not-for-profit by accident 6 years ago, but it was really intended to fill the gap for innovation. So to James's point earlier, somebody will bring him a technology and say, we do this elsewhere, can we do it in Alberta? Surya is here to prove that technology. We've invested in that innovative, with funding to prove those innovations out, to, provide some of that funding for the design and the innovation that needs to happen so that we can get that data back and we can share it through organizations like, ENBIX and other partner organizations so that we can create the capacity and the knowledge. And the intent, as Pam said this morning, was that those measures and those projects that we're invested in are meant to be scalable. They're meant to be replicated time and time again. We're supposed to be learning from them. And yes, they're done in Alberta because, as Albertans, we still have some skepticism, even if it's done somewhere else in perpetuity. We don't always believe it works here. If I had $1 for every time I heard heat pumps don't work, I would have retired already. So let's just, looking at those innovations is really killer, and then managing or starting to pair some of those technologies together that we've seen on some of our projects as well. They may not seem innovative. The innovation comes in either the location or seeing technologies paired together or what those outcomes are so that they're replicatable for those results. So I think that will also, I'm biased, of course, but that is also part of the journey that will help us see some of that move faster as we start to adopt some of those newer technologies or even processes that'll see us move faster and see more GHG reductions.
Fantastic. Well, we have 15 minutes here and a bunch of questions coming in. And I'm going to try and combine some and paraphrase, so I apologize if I don't do your questions justice. The first one is related specifically to the Canada Greener Affordable Housing Program, which it says here $170,000 per door for 70% energy and 80% greenhouse gas savings reductions. Huge opportunity, but aggressive targets. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And I would actually split it up into 2 different pieces. If you have experience with the CGAH program, please do speak to that, but also the discussion around the federally set targets for deep energy retrofits and how realistic those are in Alberta, what you're seeing from the work that you're doing. When we're talking about deep energy retrofits in Alberta, what are you seeing in the work that you're doing there? Does anyone have experience with the Canadian Greener Affordable Housing Grant Program to start with?
We're just mid-process with a client now. Once we could demonstrate that we were there, the funding came very, very quickly, which was the good news. It was with a very aged building, almost decrepit. I'm not going to name names. And that actually helped things quite a bit because the case was there to take it beyond those savings thresholds. I will say it did pretty much very quickly become evident that it needed a complete building envelope upgrade with that, and as an ongoing operational facility, that made us posit some really interesting solutions. I'm not quite sure that the market is quite there yet to build it, but we'll be finding out shortly. Is it doable? Yes, the funding can come quickly, but I'm somewhat skeptical that it would get there in many cases without touching the envelope, which we all seem to be afraid to do. I know I've had to get used to that a lot more in terms of going there. So I think envelope consultants, you are about to have a very, very busy decade and a half at least. So, and hopefully we get it right, because I know enough about it to be, having practiced in Vancouver once upon a time, leaky condo crisis, to be rather timid about getting that correct. So in our rush to try and get there, let's make sure it works and doesn't rot the building at the end.
I just want to, you heard Pam say this morning, Saria has a new website. Make sure you're going there. Some of those case studies already there on residential deep energy retrofits and how they achieved that with some of those lessons learned. So go take a look at what's there and that $170,000 a door. If I think back to the presentation this morning and the numbers that Dunsky put up, I think they had said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Tier 4 was an increase of $70,000 on new construction. $170,000 a door on a renovation seems reasonable to me for that energy reduction, just, if I'm looking at the napkin math. So, that's what my gut tells me is there. And Saria actually has some really good case studies with some of those projects already. About half of our projects are residential. So looking at those, there's a few of them in the room. Amelie's in the room, Tyler's in the room. There's some of those who are in the room today that were participants in that case study. Go out and talk to them and get a little more information. Put up your hands, Emily and Tyler. There you go. There you go. That's who they are. Do you want to add anything?
We don't have any experience with the
Yeah.
program, so I don't really have any comment on that piece.
Okay, but what about the percentages? Because those percentages are not specific to residential buildings, and our Canada and the feds have sort of set those expectations across the board for what a deep energy retrofit is in Canada. Have you had to challenge that work, or what are you seeing in the deep retrofits that you're participating in?
Yeah, so in our experience, those percentages are achievable. It's really a question of what you're starting with, because I think, to your point, if you've got a real neglected building at the start, it's going to require a lot more money to get to that goal. I mean, the baseline's probably a lot lower than it is for some other buildings, but the cost will be very high.
Okay, great. So I'm going to combine two questions here. They're both related to modeling and decarbonization plans, sort of the world that I know both with James and Luke live in daily. So the first one is about how can we standardize decarbonization plans in the industry so that we're getting the same sort of results without large variation that you would see like we used to have in the good old days with energy audit reports. And then related to that, I think there's this discussion about garbage in, garbage out in these types of models in particular. And so how are we going to design or develop these decarbonization plans that really have robust, good information going into them that's going to provide us with useful information and be something that everyone can look at and understand? Easy question.
Well, so to start with, I would say that one of the things that we work with a lot in our customer base is getting good information about the building before we even start. And there's a real either absence of information about the building, or it just exists in a ton of different documents that are randomly stored in different places with different people, or maybe in a spreadsheet over there. So it's first off kind of breaking down some of those silos within the customer organization, getting the up-to-date, accurate information about the building itself, the condition the different components are in, and then getting that all into one place so it's accessible to everybody that needs it. And from there, then we start to build a more accurate high-level model, and we don't do energy modeling at a detailed level, but we have good information to start to pass to others so that they can do create a better output than what they would otherwise be able to do.
I'm twitching because I want to talk at everybody, but I see I only have 8 minutes left, and I'm not going to take it all.
It's yours.
What I would say is the tools that we use were developed and still principally 1970s technology was focused on making new buildings greener, set up to meet new building energy codes, where it says right in there, it doesn't matter if you actually achieve this, it's about intent versus a hypothetical baseline. So some of the tools need to evolve. Our firm's approach has been to say, well, we've got tens of thousands of audits and thousands of buildings that we've retrofitted that are matched with those audits. So we pull it all into a central database and learn from it with an oversight and AI to try and say, is that output, does it make sense? And there still needs to be a human being there to look at it ultimately, because as we've been training our AI tools, they will make some really dumb things, especially around cooling, because cooling isn't on the internet the same way a heating calc is, for example. So I think we're in for a challenge because our industry is incredibly fragmented. It's fragmented between the designers, it's fragmented between the builders, and it's fragmented between the owners. And we all have pieces of data that are there that would help pull it together. The old way is you spent 30 years and maybe faked your way to 40 years of experience and intuition with it. The good news is an AI tool, again, not a panacea, not a silver bullet, but crawling through that data and meshing them seems to be a niche that's very helpful. Part of the bottleneck too is it's not sexy to build a tool in our marketplace for that. They can go and work for Google or the banks and do much, much better, or insurance companies. So we're taking engineers and trying to train them how to work with an AI and do some of that programming. Will it ever be consistent? I think so. It's early days. The fact that we're resorting to spending $30,000 a year on an AI tool is because it doesn't exist in the marketplace. And I think the marketplace will eventually respond and have something that's good out there that unifies more of us. But until then, I think it is going to be fragmented. But there's still a place to have someone or multiple someones look at this and make a judgment call. Does it make sense?
I'd agree with that. And then the layer that I'd like to add on is some of that granting program and finding some consistency even among the granting programs, so that we see out of those tools a deliverable that is the output from the tools. So everybody probably has, if you've been doing this for a while, there's an old school spreadsheet on there. Somebody's been replicating the same error in that spreadsheet for the last 12 years in perpetuity. I promise the second they unlock those formulas, you're going to find that error. It's the reality of what happens when we have these tools. I would love to see that output for funding come from the tools. But the other side of that, or the flip side is sometimes they don't know what they're asking for. We don't necessarily need ASHRAE 140 compliant tools on a townhouse. It's like starting a campfire with a flamethrower. It's not necessary. Like, throw an old school red screen model. You can see the inputs, see the outputs out there. Let's make sure we're matching the requirements to the funding commitment and to the building archetype that we're looking at the same time, because it doesn't always make sense. And there's no consistency, like zero consistency amongst programs. And if you ask questions, I'm not sure we even get a straight answer sometimes. And then on the new construction side of that, I would also love to see some, a national standard on energy modeling guidelines, because everybody can hang up a shingle and say they're an energy modeler. Some of them are mechanical. I have modelers on my team with a great architectural background that are pretty phenomenal because they understand envelope and other characteristics. I think that's really important. But some consistent energy modeling guidelines. The BC energy modeling guidelines are there. They're a really good rule of thumb, but I'd love to see them adopted nationally so that there's consistency even across markets, not unlike a harmonized energy code. So, there's good modelers and bad modelers as well.
It's like singing, everybody can, not everybody should.
And I'm not a modeler, so I often tell people if I can find the mistakes, we're in big trouble.
Fantastic. Well, we have 4 minutes left here. I'll leave you with maybe a quick last question that we've sort of been dancing around. What is the biggest obstacle for portfolio asset owners in their journey to decarbonization that calls for industry innovation? So we've got industry in the room today. What should they go home and work on?
How to talk to the CFO? No, I'm serious. We will often talk to the chief operations officer, and then it gets stuck between their, frankly, legal, I suppose, as well as the chief financial officer. It doesn't take an MBA to go and understand how to build a business case. I think we as consultants also need to do a better job of thinking beyond the operations person who's talking to us to what it's going to take to have that business case go all the way up and say it's a great idea, why didn't we do it last quarter?
There's two things that are really challenging in the multifamily sector right now that could benefit from some new approaches. So the first is really the split incentive around the tenant benefit and the owner's outlay of capital, and in these buildings where the comfort benefit and the utilities in the suite are paid directly by the tenant, but the envelope and all the other pieces are paid by the owner. It's really difficult to rationalize some really big numbers that are involved with the deep energy retrofit on those building types. And the second piece that still really hasn't been well addressed is that connection between the deep energy retrofits and the insurance risk that these companies are facing. And trying to quantify insurance risk, the impacts to insurance premiums and costs for these building owners would be a really helpful next step. Insurance and risk is something the CFO absolutely thinks about. So as much as that can get tied in, I think it will help advance these opportunities or these projects.
I feel like I just keep saying I agree. I think the key is get your data in order, get your house in order, pre-position so that you're ready for the funding that arguably is going to be available in the market. And I was going to add, on top of CFO, get your risk officer involved. This whole conversation is about mitigating risk and what that risk looks like. And we're going to pay. We're going to pay one way or another. We're going to pay with increased insurance premiums. We're going to pay in increased infrastructure costs. We're going to pay. And how we mitigate that risk is important, and your risk officer needs to understand if that means, the day an energy label goes on the door, you're no longer leasable, how that moves forward. Or if you can't sell your home because all of a sudden your home is now somebody goes, oh, I'm gonna have a $600 natural gas bill in January. I don't want this house. Location be damned. Mitigate your risk. That risk officer is important.
I think related to that too, and we sometimes get caught in the technical and financing details, is at the end of the day for our occupants, is it affordable? Like, there's an affordability crisis out there. And we were just doing a large tower last week, and the question got asked about electrification. And yes, we could do it. We're fortunate enough to be in a place for the grid. When we followed that through for what it might mean for a tenant to pay for in that particular building, in that particular case, not a sweeping generalization, it turned affordability on its head. It accomplished the opposite goal. So the road to hell, good intentions, yada, yada. Don't forget about affordability at the end of the day. I think more often than not, there's a win-win there. But sometimes we can chase the carbon and wind up with something that nobody can afford.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much to the panelists. This has been a really enlightening discussion. I got to go write down everything I just thought of to add to the program. So thank you so much for your time today. That's fantastic.